I want to welcome everyone to this year's Pickwick Club, online book club sponsored by the Dickens Project and the uh, Dickens Fellowship of Santa Cruz. And this year we are focusing on two books. We will spend the first 6 weeks of our monthly meetings on the Old Curiosity Shop, which, yes, indeed, is the featured book at the Dickens Universe. So this is a good way to prepare for the week-long event at the end of July that takes place annually in Santa Cruz and that focuses on a single Dickens novel, or at least a single 19th century novel, usually one by Dickens. And we have with us Courtney Mahaney, who's the assistant director of the Dickens Project, known to many of you, and she will be handling the tech side of today's meeting. And if you have questions, you want to make a comment, you may either use the chat at the bottom of the page. You're probably by now, everyone is familiar with the Zoom chat function. Or if you prefer, you can just wave your hand. And Courtney and I will try to notice everyone. We have a large attendance today. And in a couple of minutes, will turn things over to the president of our Pickwick Club, Wayne Batten. Thank you, Wayne, for agreeing to be the facilitator of this year's Pickwick Club. And it was Wayne who had the idea that we should do a pair of novels. And so for 6 weeks, we will talk about Curiosity Shop, the Old Curiosity Shop. And then we will spend 2 weeks talking about George Eliot's novel, very short novel, Silas Marner. And it was Wayne's idea that there are many parallels, many similarities between the two novels, and both with old men and little girls. I won't say more. And we have a reading schedule, which Courtney has circulated, but Courtney will remind people every month. The Pickwick Club meets on the fourth Sunday of every month. We do not meet in December, so the next meeting will be in November. And David Brownell has agreed to be the facilitator, the discussion leader for the November meeting, but we still need volunteers for the January, February, and March. Oh, Courtney, is that correct? Or do we have anyone who has spoken, stepped up for those months?
We have someone for January, but we still need facilitators for February and March.
Okay, February and March. So if you are interested in being a facilitator, discussion leader for February and March, get in touch with Courtney, please. And you can also look at the schedule to see which chapters of Curiosity Shop those sessions will cover. So without further ado, Wayne, take it away.
Okay. And I'm unmuted?
Yes.
Good deal. Well, just go to the first slide, Courtney, I guess. I wanted to start with an anecdote about Little Nell, because if you Google Little Nell, you will quickly discover there is a 5-star resort in Aspen, Colorado, a opulent wedding venue. And I thought, oh, wow, someone named the resort after a Dickens character. Well, not exactly. It turns out the Little Nell in Aspen was named for a silver mine that was very prosperous in 1879. The silver mine was named the little Nell, not exactly after the old curiosity shop's Nell, but after certain popular lady of the night in Aspen of that time, who evidently called herself Little Nell. So Dickens' character does survive in strange, convoluted ways. I wanted to show this genre painting, an American painting, The Lost Child, for a number of reasons, because I think the old curiosity shop requires a certain context, or at least benefits from having a certain context. And this painting is from 1881. And you'll notice the lost child is of the same class as the street urchins. We know that from the hole in her stocking. And you'll also see it's very Dickensian. The four boys on the left are very concerned. The other four are just kind of looking on, or other five, right? Observing things. So a realistic portrait of the kind of innocence and the threat to innocence that we see in the old curiosity shop. And I just listed some American writers who have excelled at this theme of innocence and experience. If you have not read Huckleberry Finn and The Catcher in the Rye as an adult, I would strongly recommend doing so, because many of us read them when we were quite young, but as with Dickens novels, they're different books when you reread them in maturity, and really quite amazing. Okay, we can go to slide 2, Courtney. And Courtney was wonderful in reposting those links to Christian Lehman's and Phyllis Orick's go-to discussions on the old curiosity shop. And I quoted from the earlier part, no, the later part, excuse me, of the old curiosity shop regarding childhood. And then you will probably recognize the lines from, let's see, Intimations of Immortality by Wordsworth. Now, just one more slide here, preparation. David Brownell is going to talk about Punch and Judy at our next meeting, so I don't want to anticipate him, but I couldn't resist this 1829 painting of a Punch and Judy show outside what looks like St. Martin's in London. But you'll notice the barefoot street vendor on the left. At least I think she's selling fruit there on the left, even though it is Christmas time. Okay, and if possible, Courtney, could we skip to the third slide from the end, since it answers a question that we've already gotten? So the third slide from the end begins the first 15 chapters. Perfect, thank you. I put in this book illustration because I think it's Dick Swiveller and Fred depicted as realistic young men instead of caricatures. But yeah, we have the meeting of Master Humphrey and Little Nell, and then Quilp discovers actual poverty. Fred persuades Dick to court Nell and reject Sophie Wackles. Quilp begins to deceive and misrepresent Kit, just out of apparently the sheer fun of doing so. And then we see the happy poor but happy home of the Nobles, contrasted with Nell and Quilp. And then Quilp, assisted by Samson Brass, confiscates the shop, and Nell and her grandfather leave London. We've already gotten this question to address the change of point of view from first to third person. And that occurs actually between chapters 3 and 4. And curiously, that's something that Edgar Allan Poe disliked in his review of The Old Curiosity Shop in Graham's magazine in 1841. But there's an elaborate backstory, and some of you perhaps know more than I do, but Dickens was always trying to make sure he had a day job in the form of a newspaper or periodical publication. He was afraid of losing his audience at some point for novels. So he started Master Humphrey's Clock with the idea that he would recycle some of his successful characters, most notably Sam Weller, who would take part in discussions with Master Humphrey. And you notice, of course, that Master Humphrey narrates in the first person in the first 3 chapters. So Master Humphrey's Clock was a weekly. And before long, Dickens discovered that it wasn't working too well. So he began serializing a novel. And this would happen later in Dickens' career in 1859, when he started All the Year Round. Again, with the idea of having sustained revenue from the periodical or the newspaper publication. But this first slide keeps popping up. Okay. But it worked, as we'll see later on. The Old Curiosity Shop took off. It was very popular in its first publication. When Dickens switched to third person in chapter 4, we pick up the same very, what used to be called limited omniscience. And I used to object to that term. How can you have limited omniscience? But instead, Dickens only selectively gives us knowledge of people's thoughts. He does move what modern critics call the focus from one character to another. So that was one question about the switching of point of view. I think it had to do with the limitations that Dickens was encountering with his initial idea of Master Humphrey, and the limitations that the first person point of view would have imposed on the story that he began with the Old Curiosity Shop. So I'll open up. Does anyone else have any preliminary questions about the novel? This is a novel that was very popular. The newspaper rose to 100,000 subscriptions, which in 1840 was a lot of people in London. And by late in Dickens' career, by the time of his death, the Old Curiosity Shop had lost some of its stature, and it certainly lost a lot of its stature among critics. But does anyone have any preliminary questions here about the novel or its switch of point of view, popularity or lack thereof?
John?
I would add just one other thing about this. I think it's useful to remember that Dickens is not the novelist of Bleak House and Great Expectations, the novelist who planned the novel in advance and had many details worked out in his mind and a monthly set of notes that he kept as a guide to the construction of his novel. He's still finding his way as a writer. And he's a very successful writer. You remember Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, and Nicholas Nickleby are the novels that precede The Old Curiosity Shop. And he knows that he's successful, but he wants to try something new. And the something new that he wants to try is a periodical, a magazine. And the magazine is not intended to be a place where novels will appear. It's going to be a series of anecdotes and stories. And it's the form is based on the 18th century model of the Spectator and the Rambler, these periodicals that were developed in the 18th century and that are often called miscellanies because they're miscellaneous. And so when Dickens started his magazine, he wrote short stories, or he thought of it as being short stories. And Master Humphrey is the convener of a kind of book club. And the members of the book club tell stories to each other. And Mr. Pickwick shows up and tells some stories. It's recycling characters from his past successful novels. But the sales of the periodical began to drop. And so he makes the decision in the middle of this original design to turn what initially for him was a short story, a story about Nell and her grandfather that was not going to continue. He decides to turn that into a novel, and the sales pick up. So Dickens is writing to an audience, and he's inventing it as he goes along. And part of the confusion and incoherence and plot strands that do and don't develop, characters that appear and then disappear and don't come back, is I think a reflection of the fact that he's inventing this as he goes along. And he's still a very young man. He's not yet 30 years old, but he's already published 3 successful novels. And here comes number 4 that he's kind of making up on the fly. So this early start, including the shift in perspective and point of view from first person to third person, is an indication of the fact that he's inventing the novel as he writes it. And it's also, and this is the other important thing to say about Master Humphrey's Clock, is that it's a weekly serial. Now, Pickwick and Nicholas Nickleby were monthly serializations. They were in the familiar format that the other long novels. Oliver Twist was different. It was in a magazine. It appeared in Bentley's magazine, but it was a monthly. And so Dickens is writing for a shorter format. Each issue of Master Humphrey's Clock was 12 pages long, and he's writing for the weekly, and that means he's writing at great speed because he doesn't have a whole month to write his monthly number. he's got 1 week to fill the pages. And initially he thought he was going to fill only a couple of pages with each story. And then suddenly, because the sales have fallen, he decides that he's going to make it into a novel. And so the Old Curiosity Shop grows out of this odd moment of invention and adaptation to a new format, a new way of writing. So some of the chaos, some of the improvised quality of the novel, particularly at the beginning, is owing to these circumstances of publication. So David, and then Jessica.
Okay. For me, one of the interests of Old Curiosity Shop is that Dickens is really winging it. He doesn't know where he's going. It's not planned. And I think at this point, the question, what is a novel, was one that was very unsettled. There's a letter later on where Dickens isn't sure whether he's already written novels or whether Barnaby Rudge is his first novel. That's like Walter Scott, and everyone would agree Scott was a novelist. But Dickens started out among a bunch of people, a bunch of young men who were scrambling to make money by writing. And if you look at the early productions of people like Thackeray and other writers who appeared in Punch, they tend not to be what we would think of as novels. Dickens was close to a number of the members of the Punch gang. Mark Lemon, the editor, was a good friend of his. So he doesn't have a definition of a novel or examples of a 19th century novel to guide him. He's making up the genre as well as the story. John and Wayne, you may have something to say to answer that.
No, those are good points. And I think a young man inventing the form, making it up as he goes along. For me, it's exciting to think of this as an experimental book. It's not a finished work. Finished in the sense of planned and executed according to plan. But Jessica.
I think to add on to what you said earlier about him not having intended this to be a novel originally is particularly noticeable in the depiction of Nell, and specifically her age. In the first chapters, she is such a child that Master Humphreys feels the need to hold her hand as he's walking her back to her home, and he's shocked that she's out at this hour and that she's being left alone in the house by herself. And you really get the sense that she is 9-10 years old, that she's very young. And then we make the transition to the third person narrator and everything starts to change, and you have her brother and Dick talking about marrying her off, and you have Quilp talking about marrying her, and you find out that she's 14, which obviously still quite young, but in that time not nearly as young. And someone, she could have been working in a factory, she could have had a job, and there's just this big shift of her age and the way that we're supposed to see her, as someone who will be able to lead her grandfather off into the country and hopefully take care of them. And it really shows in a way that we don't see in so many of Dickens' novels how he was not prepared for this to be a long narrative, and for this character to have to be quite as responsible adult like as she ends up having to be. It would have been quite more shocking if she remained 10 and still had to do all of the things that she will have to do. So I find that really interesting to see him kind of have to backtrack a little bit.
Good points. And Nell's age is something to keep track of. Where is she in relation to puberty, for example? Has she reached puberty yet? The third person narrator refers to her consistently as the child. So is she child, or is she woman, or is she child woman? Is she on a threshold between the two? Quilp's interest in her, which has a sexual predatory dimension to it. I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah. So, Martha. Martha.
Not hearing you too well. So, I really raised my hand for another reason, but I'd like to comment on this child idea. At this time in England, I believe 13 was the age that you could become a prostitute. And because it was later in the century where William Stead tried to get the age up to 16 and had a big problem doing that. He ended up in jail. And so I think the issue, and very concerned about what these girls go through, and wants to bring that to the attention of his readers. And that goes to what I was going to talk about in the first place. Is I really was not all that thrilled about reading this book. And then I opened the book and I read the 12 chapters pretty much in order in a fairly short period of time. And I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Good.
I think from beginning to end, we went from one point to another. He made a lot of he beautifully connected each different scene, different characters, some horrible, some wonderful, like Kit, so shall we say. And I think for being such an early novel of his, I think he's showing great talent. And not that we necessarily like some of the things we're reading because they're really traumatic. But I just think it's wonderfully written.
Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and it's a strange book. It's a grotesque book. It's very different from Great Expectations, for example, but wonderful in its own way. So, Mary.
I agree completely with Jessica. As a matter of fact, she took the words out of my mouth as to Nell or Little Nell or Nellie's age. And it's reflected too in the illustrations. I'm reading the Gutenberg version, and I don't know who did the illustrations. They're really quite good. But in those illustrations, Nell looks like a different age. Who did do some of the famous illustrations for this work?
Wayne, do you want to talk about the illustrations?
I'll refer you to Christian Lehman on that point. He has a wonderful presentation on the three illustrators. and it's available on Dickens to go.
All
So
right.
I can't even begin to rival what Christian does with the illustrations.
All right, thank you.
I can say a little bit about the illustrators. There are actually 4 illustrators for the novel, but two principal illustrators, and they are Cattermole and Fizz. I think it's George Cattermole, who specialized in architectural scenes. So if you see a building, either the interior of a building or the exterior of a building, it's probably a Cattermole illustration. And if you see an illustration that is principally characters and in a sort of caricatural mode, that's Hablot Brown, or Fizz as the name that he went by. And then there are 2 other illustrators, each of whom does one single illustration in the novel. And they're a man named Samuel Williamson and Daniel MacLeese, and their illustrations appear later. So mostly what we have seen is Cattermole and Fizz, architecture and caricature. And that accounts to some extent for the difference in the representations of Nell. So Wayne, do you want to proceed?
We'll hear from Glenna first. And
oh yes, I see. Go ahead.
I read this novel many years ago and had never had any urge to reread it, unlike most of Dickens. My question at this point is, why is it called The Old Curiosity Shop? I mean, you don't get that in the first 12 chapters, particularly.
What do people think? Martha?
I've been doing some weekly Zoom meetings with a woman who speaks about Florentine art in the Renaissance. And so the idea of curiosity shops and curiosity museums, etc., have come up several times. And I think I'm just guessing here on this on the 19th century, but I think it was a popular thing. And I think it just went into his idea of where he wanted his story to go. And that people would kind of like buying a book because it was an interest at the time of the writing of the book.
What is a curiosity shop? And what is this curiosity shop?
Are you asking all of us?
Yes, I'm asking everyone.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. Whoever was speaking.
David?
A lot of the rulers in Europe had their own little museums, which were very much miscellaneous in content. Anything seemed worth collecting. I think one thing about this title, its 3 predecessors all have the name of a character. Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby. And this title leaves Dickens free to go wherever his storytelling takes him. I don't know whether there's anything more to that choice.
Dorothy. Did you have something to add, Dorothy, to the question of the title?
Raise your hand, Absolutely.
Dorothy, we're not hearing you, so I'm gonna.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was
okay.
saying that I would think given the original pattern for the book, that people would be coming into the shop and perhaps pick up an object or notice an object, and that a tale might arise from that object.
Okay. David's point is a good one that fits with what you just said. It's a place title rather than a character title. And the Curiosity Shop is the place where the novel begins. So it's possible that the Curiosity Shop is a little bit like the clock in the Master Humphrey's clock, which is a place. They gather around the fireside, and each week they pull a different story out of a different manuscript out of the clock and read it. So it's possible that the Curiosity Shop has a similar structure, that you could find a strange object and then tell a story about the strange object that is found in the Curiosity Shop. But one of the things we have to remember is that the title comes before there's a novel or before there's a story. Originally, it was going to be a one-off production, a description of the Curiosity Shop of grandfather, and the little girl, and maybe it wouldn't go beyond that. But then Dickens needs to develop a story, and so the story leaves the Curiosity Shop. In the first 12 chapters, we've left the Curiosity Shop, and will we ever return to the Curiosity Shop? How important is the Curiosity Shop other than as a setting from which to launch the story that will go elsewhere? But there's another reason I think that we might dig into the title, and it's the word curiosity.
So Margaret has had her hand up, and I just want to make sure that we get to her.
Margaret.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. And I agree with what John said about curious, that it's something that draws your interest. It's curiosities, what you want to find out what they are and explore. And but I want to talk about the unlikability of most of the characters that are introduced in the first few chapters. And I wonder what was Dickens' objective with that, because I find all of the characters, except little Nell, of course, so likable, but the others are all negatively, in my opinion, presented. And of course, that is for a reality of what life is, that people are like that. I mean, including the gossips who gather at the house of the villain of the piece, and who are there for gossipy reasons and not to help the poor woman. And but I would just like to introduce that as a thought about the book, that these characters are unlikable, including even if they're funny. And what kind of humor is there in this book? What is the humor? Is it satire? Mr. Quilp is introduced very grotesquely, to use John Jordan's word. They're grotesque gathering of characters. And little Nell then is in great contrast to everybody else. So, well, that's my main point right now, is is the unlikability of the characters and how that contrasts, in my opinion, with a lot of other Dickens novels that we've discussed at Dickens Universe. So does anybody else want to jump in about that? The unlikability of the characters?
Yes, please. Martha, Blair, Pat.
Yes, excuse me. I kept wondering why Dickens has two dwarfs that are in this novel. I mean, certainly there were more dwarfs in those days, statistically, than there are now. And why are they both included in this story? It just seems like an oddity to me. I couldn't get my hand around it and try to forget that after a while and not obsess about it.
Who's the second dwarf?
Well, let's see, Kit is a dwarf and Quilp is a dwarf, correct?
I don't think Kit is a dwarf. No.
Oh,
I think there's only one dwarf.
okay,
One
maybe I was
memorable
obsessing.
dwarf.
Maybe I was obsessing about dwarfs.
Okay. But you tend to agree, I think, about unlikability. So,
Yes.
Martha, Blair, David.
Yeah, I would like to go back to the title. I'm married to a novelist, and she has quite a collection of novelists as friends and acquaintances. And one of the many things I've learned from being around this group is the difficulty they have with titles. And in this group of people, the last thing that they would do is choose a title before they wrote the book. Because books tend to write themselves. And then when you're done, you have to sit around and figure out what title fits that which evolved itself. I think The Old Curiosity Shop is a title that Dickens was stuck with. And fortunately, it's an attractive title, but anyway, that's my my opinion, informed by my spouse and her friend.
Okay. Who have the luxury of finishing a novel and then choosing the title under which it will be published, rather than choosing a title and then having to write something that starts with the title and then invents itself as it goes along. David.
A lot of early Dickens, the characters are very much from the stage rather than from Dickens inward. And I think the unlikability of the characters, and Martha's right about that, is partly because they're from the stage. Nell's grandfather is very underdeveloped, it seems to me. The title, in some ways, the novel is a collection of curiosities. A lot of the characters are curiosities of one sort and another. I'll pass from there.
Mary.
Yeah, as to address the idea of why Dickens chose a dwarf, I think in his time, dwarfs were considered curiosities. Somebody who might end up in a sideshow or something. So I think it reinforces the grotesqueness of the book to have Quilp be a dwarf. Standards are different today. We don't look upon people who are, we say, vertically challenged in that way. But at that time, I think people did.
And that comment, very perceptive one, I think fits with what David said, that the novel itself is a kind of curiosity shop full of curious people and things and places and episodes. It's a kind of sideshow. The novel is a sideshow. It's not a tightly constructed, tightly plotted novel in the way that, again, to use the contrast example, Great Expectations is. Great Expectations, the novel that we discussed in the most recent Pickwick Club, has a beginning, a middle, and an end that are closely tied together and thought through. And this novel is sort of happening as it goes along. What's going to pop up next? What's the next curiosity we're going to run into? So I think that characters are curiosities, and one other thing I would suggest about the curiosity shop that is functional to the story as a whole is that in the opening description of the curiosity shop, the principal feature of that description is the contrast between the grotesque objects in the shop and the purity and innocence of Nell as the central character. And that contrast between menacing, threatening background and innocent, pure, childlike foreground is something that will continue through the entire novel. So that contrast between purity and evil, goodness and badness, likableness and unlikableness even, is something that Dickens is going to build on, and that's a standard way of constructing a melodramatic story. And melodrama, the theater background that David mentioned, is very much what this novel is exploring and exploiting, as well as other forms of popular culture. So who's next? Bill Jordan.
Thanks. I think that the accounts so far suggest that Dickens was looking at the old curiosity shop in terms of objects, and there's a lot of description and narrative about that. But having paid attention to his choice of words, I noted the first time that curiosity or some variant on that word appeared in the text, and it's associated with Master Humphrey, and he's curious about the relationship between Nell and her grandfather. And the chapter ends with Master Humphrey's weird sort of stalking back and forth in the street near the house, and then going home and has this really lovely paragraph, page 22. It would be a curious speculation, said I, after some restless turns across and across the room, to imagine her in her future life holding her solitary way among a crowd of wild, grotesque companions, the only pure, fresh, youthful object in the throng. It would be curious to find, dash. And that's the rest of the story. So I think the old curiosity shop is about the curious story that Master Humphrey discovers when he finds this little girl and takes her home.
A very good observation, I would say, and it points to another meaning of the word curiosity. Not curiosity as an object of curiosity, but curiosity as an attitude, as a questioning, seeking, wonderment about the future. And I think that Master Humphrey's curiosity, the word curious and curiosity do appear frequently in chapter 1. And as we read forward, we should look for other examples of the word curious or curiosity. But the reader's curiosity is something that is invoked here. What is grandfather's secret? You know, Nell has a secret, and Quilp wants to get Nell's secret from Nell's secret knowledge about the grandfather's secret. And at the simplest level, it's, does grandfather possess a great fortune? And Quilp believes so, and the other characters believe that grandfather has a great fortune. And of course, the first revelation is that grandfather does not have a great fortune, that grandfather is a gambler, he's addicted to speculation, and somehow he has created the illusion that he's a wealthy man and that Quilp can invest in him. This is, you know, Quilp seems like such a shrewd businessman in other respects that it seems, I'm a little surprised that Quilp has been deceived by grandfather to the extent that apparently he has been. But our curiosity as readers is what's happening? What's the secret? What will this story really turn out to be about? And in that paragraph that Bill read, I would highlight one phrase. It would be a curious speculation, said I, after some restless turns across the room, to imagine her in her future life, holding her solitary way among a crowd of wild, grotesque companions. Imagine her in her future life. What is Nell's future life? And of course, it's no secret, it's not a spoiler to say that little Nell doesn't have much of a future life. What will happen to Nell when she grows up? Well, Nell doesn't have a chance of growing up. Nell is, anyway, you know, if you know anything about the Old Curiosity Shop, you know that Nell does not survive the novel. So even this little hint about her future life is a kind of premonition that we should think about and perhaps worry about her future life. We should be curious about it. So curiosity as an attitude on the part of the reader is, I think, one of the, you know, why do we keep reading this book? We want to find out what happens to little Nell. That's our driving motive. That's our curiosity. But
John, shall we turn things back over to Wayne?
we should turn things back over to Wayne.
Okay. I did some work on the background, Courtney, and let's see if we could go to, let's see, the fifth slide, Victoria and Albert. And this really connects with the fascination with little Nell. I was just trying to suggest some of the context in which Dickens is writing how refreshing it was to have an 18-year-old young woman to be queen after the previous monarchs, and the great popularity that she enjoyed. Dickens jokingly said that he himself was infatuated with the young Victoria. There were stalkers, for example, caused her some problems. Here we have the Landseer painting, Windsor Castle in Modern Times. And that's evidently their first child, the Princess Victoria on the left, unhygienically playing with the dead birds that Albert has brought home. And I mentioned that Victoria had 9 children, actually in only about 7 years, first 7 years of her marriage to Albert. So she spent a good part of her time pregnant or recovering from pregnancy, at which times Albert actually had a great deal of power. And of course, I wanted to point out that Albert is wearing the most stylish pair of boots I've ever seen. So, a man of high style. In 1838 and 39, there was a good deal of Chartist unrest, riots. These were men demanding a reform in the vote. 3 of them, of the organizers, were condemned to death when the young Victoria commuted their sentences from death to transportation. And so she clearly was a very sympathetic figure. Let's see, we can go to the next slide, I guess. This is another reason, I think, for the fascination that little Nell had for readers, as for Dickens, is the revival of King Lear that took place in 1838. As you may realize that Nahum Tate in 1681 created a revised version of King Lear, not only with a happy ending, but observing the classical unities of time, place, and action. It was only in 1838 when William Macready restored most, anyway, of Shakespeare's King Lear. The curious thing, particularly though for this novel, is that in his first efforts, Macready did not want to restore the Fool. The Fool, remember, is the court jester who makes fun of King Lear, but also tries to bring him to a degree of self-awareness during Lear's banishment. But in 1838, William Macready had the impulse to cast a young woman as the Fool. So that her name was Priscilla Horton. And the change was very popular and very successful. And I've printed here part of Dickens' review of a revival of King Lear, starring Macready again in 1848. But Dickens clearly expresses here his fascination with the bond between Lear and Cordelia. The illustration does not show Lear and the Fool. It shows Lear and Cordelia, of course, right at the end. But this I think was part of the context in which Dickens wrote and in which his readers read the Old Curiosity Shop. And I quoted never, 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 never. Does anyone recognize that line? Okay, maybe just one more in this series, Courtney, the one of Mary Hogarth. Yes, a third influence, I think, on Dickens was the sudden death of Mary Hogarth, his sister-in-law, at age 17. In 1837, they had been out to the theater, if I remember correctly, and gotten back to the Dickens house when she suddenly collapsed. And I think he gave her some brandy or something, thought she was recovering, but she died. He thought of heart failure right there. So that he was clearly very moved by the death of Mary. Mary had moved in partly to help Catherine Dickens through her first pregnancy. I'm sure that actually Mrs. Dickens was very helpful, glad to have her sister and later Georgina, another sister, to help out managing a household at this time and constantly pregnant. Okay, yeah. We've already touched on some of the topics that struck me, and one of them has to deal with the contrast, of course, between little Nell and her innocence and the cast of grotesque characters, somewhat unattractive characters around her. The question of dwarfism concerned me because some movies like The Wizard of Oz create problems because of the cast of dwarves who were hired to perform the Munchkins may no longer be politically correct. But I was wondering if people have, you've talked about why Quilp was a dwarf. But I guess another question is, why does he cut so much ice? How is it possible that he's married what seems like a perfectly likable and attractive young woman? And any explanations for this man's attractiveness, apparently, charm? David.
With Quilp, I think he fits into a long tradition of the belief that physical grotesqueness accompanied evil or moral failure. Think of Richard III, for example. This goes on into the 19th century. Think of Rigoletto.
And Rigoletto has a beautiful daughter who is destroyed by a nobleman. Yes. And Sarah had a point.
Yeah, so you asked why she's attracted to Daniel Quilp. I'm not sure she's attracted. So I think there are two clues. One, when she sits with the ladies and she tells the ladies, you have no idea, if I die, he'll find somebody right away. So other women will be attracted to him. And then she says, that's what her mom told her. So I guess her mom was very interested in this marriage and told her that he is attractive to women and he can get any woman he wants. And maybe they just, and the mom lives with them in the house. So maybe they just didn't have enough money and it was a marriage for having a home to live in, both of them.
Yes, the question of finance is an important one, I think, for that character.
And she's a very nice person. We can see it when he sends her to talk to Nellie and get some information from her, how sensitive she is about it and how much she doesn't want to do any harm to Nellie. So she's a very nice person and she probably can be nice to anyone.
Let's see, Bill had his hand up.
Yeah, I echo what Sarah said. A couple of things that for further evidence of that, there's an exchange between Mrs. Ginwin, that's Daniel Quilp's mother-in-law, and she's and Daniel Quilp, and she's talking about her late husband. And this is the top of page 42 in the Penguin edition, says, her father was a blessed creature, Quilp, and worth 20,000 of some people. And then Quilp responds and said, I should have liked to known him. I dare say he is a blessed creature then. So the novelist takes the point of correcting her mispronunciation, which suggested to me that she's from a lower economic class than Quilp. Quilp, as reported earlier in the novel, has a lot of very successful connections with people on the exchange and in the customs houses and so on and so forth. And so I think she got her daughter to marry Quilp for his money. And the other thing that sort of reinforces that in my mind is that Quilp becomes interested in Nell once he realizes that her grandfather and she are poor. And so he thinks he can use his money as an inducement for her to become the second Mrs. Quilp.
Margaret, did you have your hand up?
Yes. Can you hear me, Courtney? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it is in the text that Mrs. Quilp, before she got married to the Quilp, was attracted to him and was also, it is in the text as Dickens wrote it, and also that the mother encouraged that marriage. And in the paragraph that I'm sorry I can't find because I'm reading an ebook because I have a problem with my eyes right now. And so that's why I've had depended upon the ebook. But there is that testimony from Dickens himself that she was attracted to him, and that's why she married him, with her mother's push to do that too, and that she's regretted it all of her married life, which is, I think, only about 3 years at the point where we meet her. So, and but also I think that we could introduce different subjects that were brought up by the slides that we're seeing, like with the slide of King Lear, and the treatment of age in this book from the very beginning, from the first chapter, when the narrator ascertains that the old man, the father in the curiosity shop, is not senile, that he half expects him to be senile. So that is a within the narrative of the story, that old people are expected to be senile. That's always a consideration. And also in the treatment of women, the women who gather around Mrs. Quilp and who visit her seemingly to console her, but actually they are attacking her as they gather and eat her splendid tea. And so that, again, that brings to mind that the point that I made earlier about the unlikability of a lot of the characters, and it just goes on, continues on and on, like with the gathering of the women. So, but those two subjects in the book, I think, are throughout it: old age and a feminist point of view, which is strangely twisted. And I think that a lot of the characters speak in a twisted way, like Swiveller, Swiveller, who is such a great character, and who is introduced by a maid in the house he's renting in. There's a letter for you, Mr. Sniveler. So I love that. And that's the other thing that I'd like us to talk about, as time goes on, about the humor. What kind of humor is it? Is it satire? Is it, what kind is it? Because I don't find myself laughing out loud, but there still is a lot of humor, and even in the depiction of Quilp as the villain of the piece. And I'm very glad that you brought up, that many of you brought up the idea of melodrama as being a factor in the writing of the book. Anyway, I'm going on and on too long. I apologize, but I'm enjoying this discussion even when I'm not talking. Thank you.
Glenna and then Barb.
Well, excuse me. I'm glad Margaret brought up that scene with Mrs. Quilp and her mother and the women friends. I found that very upsetting, because it seemed to me that the author's point of view, which isn't expressed but implicit, is that it's incumbent on Mrs. Quilp to put up with what she's being dealt with. These other women are stirring her up in some nefarious way, and she has to accept it. She married him. He's the head of the household, and what he offers is what she has to put up with. And I found that upsetting.
Gender is an important issue in this story. So and as is age, and so we should track both of those topics as we go forward. Barb?
Yeah, two things about Quilp. I mean, he's definitely over the top, right? I mean, he's exaggerated, and in a way that makes him funny. Margaret was talking about humor. That scene in which he's got his wife trapped up all night, it's very unpleasant, but it is funny the way that, after the fifth time that he says Mrs. Quilp and she answers Quilp, it becomes kind of humorous, because we know exactly what's going on there and how he is acting, and he gets to pull off all these lines that are like the elementary schoolyard bully, do this and I'm gonna beat you up kind of thing, which as I say, turns out to be somewhat humorous.
I do want to talk about Dick Swiveller, but I'd like to get more reactions to Quilp. How do people respond to Quilp? Unlikable, certainly, but that doesn't seem to me quite adequate as a way to describe him or characterize his presence in the book. Barb finds some humor in Quilp. He seems to have his way with women in a strange a strange power? As does physical deformity mean moral deformity and depravity? That's certainly one part of him. Is he a supernatural character? Does he belong to the human race?
Dorothy?
I find him menacing when he ruminates about Nell. Maybe Mrs. Quilp will become ill in a few years. And you have the feeling he will make her become ill and might kill her.
David?
Quilp, Quilp is a self-aware villain who enjoys playing the villain.
Yeah.
Finds himself comic. And again, Richard III is a good example.
Sarah?
Yeah, so what David said, he's totally cruel. And they tell it, he just enjoys. Like when he asks his wife to sit there all night, he makes her sit there all night. And he enjoys when he sees that she's suffering. And he's also manipulative because they described in several sections, like at the end when he takes over everything. And suddenly his voice becomes so soft, like he's really sad about what happened. So he's manipulative, and of course manipulative when he wants his wife to ask Nellie what's happening, and he tries to find out if they still have money or they don't have money. Yeah. I don't want to think that it has to do anything with his physical deformity because they don't say anything about it. What's his name? Tick, her friend, he has some type of deformity too, but he's like the nicest person ever.
Lena?
Yeah, I think Quilp is awful. I found him menacing, and I think the reason I have not gone back to rereading this novel is probably because I found Quilp to be so unpleasant to even read about. In a way, it reminds me of my reaction to Bill Sykes, who's written about a little bit earlier. When I reread Oliver Twist, and I have reread that at least once or twice, I have to skip the death of Nancy. It's just too, I know, and Dickens made a big point of reading that scene as a, on the stage, but I cannot deal with the death of Nancy. And I don't like Bill Sykes as a character, and I don't like Quilp as a character. My children accuse me of being too nicey nice, and they're probably right, but I don't like reading about Quilp.
Cynthia?
Thank you. People have mentioned the theater and melodrama, and I just wondered if there was any fairy tale factors here, with Nell being a princess and Quilp being an ogre. That's how he struck me, was sort of a quintessential, exaggerated monster like Rumpelstiltskin. Any thoughts?
Gary?
Yes, thank you. I haven't read this novel since I was a junior in high school 100 years ago. And having started it, I like what was just said about the fairy tale aspect of it, because I definitely think it's here. I think it's interesting the way Quilp introduces his wife when he's with Nell and the others, when he's with the grandfather. And you get this sense almost that he's going home to her being upset with him, and a sort of like that she's going to be a problem, that it's the opposite we discover, that it's him that's the menace. But it's an interesting thing that Dickens does with that, that finally then when he arrives home, it's the women who are basically being so nasty with his wife, basically. So, and he's in the midst of that. And if you look at the picture in our penguin, he's on the side kind of observing it. So it's an interesting introduction of that character as I read it this time.
Will I start your slides again?
Sure. John mentioned Dick Swiveller, so this might be a good time to go to, let's see, the slide 11 is the photo of Dickens, shows Dickens seated. This is the one, thank you. I've already mentioned that the Master Humphrey's Clock benefited from the publication of The Old Curiosity Shop. Actually, Dickens was irritated to find himself stuck writing weekly serial installments. At least I think he complained to Forster about it. And then it would happen all over again later in his career. But yeah. If you'll show the next slide, this pertains to Dick Swiveller. I was going to ask if there are other characters in the novel that maybe we're not supposed to like, but we end up liking anyway. But I can't help but think the illustrators were influenced by the way Dickens habitually sat in his chair. Anyway, yeah. About Dick Swiveller, I mentioned here Tom Jones. So I think later on in our discussions, I want to get back to the question of plot, because Dickens really had two very different models of plotting. One, the picaresque tradition, and the other one, the highly structured, controlled example of Henry Fielding. But I think we'll see later on then Dick Swiveller is one of the few characters who really changes and progresses. So I don't want to anticipate too much, but in the second half of the novel, especially, Dick Swiveller, or Richard Swiveller, really does change and mature to some degree. So I guess that's goes to this question: are there other characters we're not supposed to like but we do like, or characters we're supposed to like but we don't like, perhaps?
Martha?
I think everybody likes Kip. He's a character that's pretty stable and cares very much for Nell and Grandpa, and it's so helpful, that scene where he offers Nell to come to her house, his house. It was just so sweet, and I almost cried. He's very giving. So it's nice to have some positive characters.
Yes, Sarah?
So if we talk about Mr. Swiveller, and we mentioned if there is humor before, I found a section where he orders a dinner and doesn't plan to pay for it. And then how he goes to a further restaurant and everything, it was very funny.
Barbara?
I was just giving her a thumbs up.
Oh.
That's not my hand, it's just a thumbs up.
Shall we continue with the slides?
Let's see. I guess we can back up here to slide 10, or rather maybe slide 9 or 10, either one, Courtney. Oh, yes, this is fine. I have a project I've not carried out, which is to write a book on sentimentality. And it would include perhaps some of the sentimentality in this novel. But an important figure is the Earl of Shaftesbury, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, which I've pictured here, along with his descendant, the current Earl of Shaftesbury, Earl number 12. And if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, you'll quickly learn that the two rivers that's to the west and the east of the city are the Ashley and the Cooper rivers. They were named for this man, Lord Shaftesbury. But he comes up particularly in connection with this novel because his descendant, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, was a strong voice for labor reform in the 1830s. Very complicated business. One of the efforts was to get a 10-hour day, or limit days to 10 hours, which in the 1830s seemed unbelievably short. And of course, later in the novel, we'll see a depiction of the industrial town that Nell and her grandfather passed through. But benevolism was the idea that it makes us feel good to do good, to help people. And it ran into the face of laissez-faire theory, and consequently made any kind of regulation of labor very difficult. So the general argument is that the sentiment is a good thing, as the sentiment aroused by little Nell and her plight and the anguish she experiences and pity for her can be the basis for right moral action, for doing the right thing. And yeah, a lost book to scholarship. I have not written that book on benevolism and sentimentality.
Clark, I just saw your comment. Would you like to read it and to talk more about that? Well, in the comments, he wrote a tangential comment. I learned just yesterday that Carson McCullers named Dickens, along with Shakespeare and Thomas Wolfe, as a favorite author. I wonder if this novel had any influence on her own shop of curiosities, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, Quilp and Cousin Lyman. Are other people familiar with that novel, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe?
Hi, Courtney.
Oh, hi there.
I just learned that yesterday. I was reading a paper from a student about a very different novel. And she quoted Carson McCullers, and I didn't recognize the quotation. And it was about a kind of false nostalgia, yearning for something that you never even knew about. You just imagined something that you wanted to exist. And I looked it up, and in the process, was an article she wrote in 1940. And she named Dickens and Shakespeare and Thomas Wolfe as her great influences, which is a kind of curious collection. She actually says that Thomas Wolfe is not a good writer, but she likes him anyway. But I just, that's been rumbling around in my head, and I am kind of fascinated by fictional freaks. I actually teach a course called Rebels, Fools, and Freaks. And I just thought about it. I mean, Cousin Lyman's a curious character. He's very unpleasant. He is narcissistic. He is brutal, and also comical. And he's a curiosity. He raises questions about human existence. You know, he is attracted to a male, but an older woman loves him as well. It creates a vicious love triangle. But you know, Quilp is the same kind of character. He is brutal. He is violent. And Dickens constantly pairs moments of Quilp's existence with positive descriptions. There's kind of crazy irony that Dickens creates in depicting this guy, that he is horrible and kind of funny at times. To me, it's very confusing and interesting.
Barb, did you have your hand up?
No, Clark covered it. Other than the fact that we could probably compare some other Carson McCullers things to Dickens, but that's off the track.
Margaret?
Yes, Courtney, I'd like to go back to Quilp and to the character that is associated with him as the guard. It's the boy who stands on his head and who is a humorous character, but he's there for some purpose, whether it is to highlight a humor in the situation or to illustrate another person that Quilp has in his power. And that is something that I'd like to talk about regarding Quilp's character, that he seems to have something on all of his clients, including, of course, the grandfather, but also the lawyer, Brass. What does he have on Brass? Is there a debt that Brass owes to him. That's my question, if anybody else has picked up on that. And the other point I'd like to make is the pairings of different characters, like with Fred Trent and Swizzler. They're a pair, and one works off the other. And it seems also that Fred has something on Swizzler also, that he has a control. And I think that that is something that's running throughout the first 12 chapters that we read for this first discussion, is that there is a control that people have over other characters, including the grandfather's control over little Nell, because as he says repeatedly, he gambles for her. This is for her. So she is complicit. She's drawn into the whole thing. And so she might conclude that this is her fault. Anyway, these are some thoughts I have, and I'd like others to comment. Thanks.
David?
Brass and his sister agree that Quilp is their principal client, and that's the hold he has on them.
Sarah?
So amongst the relationships that what's her name mentioned, I just want to talk about Quilp and the boy who stood on his head. It seems like this is one guy who is not afraid of Quilp and keeps standing on his head. And it's also nice that when Nell comes in and he asks her, look out the window, because he's lying down to catch up on his sleep. And is he standing on his head? And she immediately says no. And I was thinking it's probably yes, but she says no. But there is a sentence there that says that they are actually liking one another. So it's kind of a funny game to both of them. So, and the second couple that the lady mentioned, I forgot her name, is very interesting, I think. It's Nell and her grandfather. So it's very interesting when we realize, so Nell is this like happy, joyful child. She's not afraid to stay up all night, and she doesn't care if he leaves. And she tells the first narrator, I'll be okay, I'll be okay. And then at some point, we learn that she's actually miserable, and she stays up all night and is very scared. So they have two different viewpoints. Like the grandfather has a viewpoint that she has to be very, very rich to be happy, because her mother died out of poverty, and she only being very rich will save the girl in the future. And the girl has a philosophy that let's be like we used to be. Let's enjoy one another. You don't need that much money to be happy in the future. So, but she acts as if she believes in grandfather and as if she's happy all the time. She doesn't show him that she's worried. She doesn't show him that she thinks differently. And I thought that this was interesting. She is so much sure, but she doesn't have a way to tell him, I'm not really happy with this way of life. Let's change it.
John?
I, first of all, need to apologize. I missed about 15 minutes of the discussion because my Zoom connection failed, but I'm back and wanted to say a few more things about Quilp, and also about Quilp and the boy who stands on his. Am I audible? Yes, I think I am. One word that I think is useful in talking about Quilp is fascination. I think Quilp is fascinating, that he's both repulsive and unlikable, if you will, but also very engaging. And I mean, there's more activity, there's more verbal energy in the narration about Quilp than there is about just about any other character in the book so far. Swiveller being a possible exception, but I think Swiveller and Quilp are the two characters who energize the narrative voice to a greater extent than any other characters. Nell stands as a kind of icon, and she has full sympathy from the narrator, but she doesn't evoke the narrator's engaged writing voice. She stands apart in her innocence, in her purity, in her isolation. But Quilp, as soon as the narrator starts describing what Quilp does, how he smokes cigars and how he eats raw eggs with their shells, and there's a vitality about Quilp that I think is fascinating. And he's comic and disgusting and frightening and superhuman and subhuman. He's also, and this gets at the boy who stands on his head. The boy who stands on his head is Quilp's playmate. They play together. They have fun together. How do they have fun? They fight and they attack each other. And it's like two adolescent boys, if you will, whose way of making contact, because they don't have other emotional resources that enable them to talk, is that they have physical contact. They fight, and they like each other at the end of that. And Quilp can abuse him verbally and can attack him physically, but it doesn't seem to bother either of them. So there's a way in which Quilp is a horrible ogre. He's a capitalist. He's a shipbreaker. He's involved in financial schemes with Samson Brass. We don't know exactly what the power is that he has over Samson Brass. We'll learn more about that. But he's also a kid with all of the inhibitions, the lack of inhibitions that a boy might have. Quilp is at play in this world. He likes to poke people. He likes to get in their faces. He likes to cause trouble. He's a prankster. He's a joker. And I think we don't quite know what he will do next. And so part of what we are reading for in this book, part of our curiosity, is to find out what Quilp will do next, because he'll do something extraordinary. And so anyway, that's I think that the boy who stands on his head is someone who enters into the world of play that Quilp invites us into.
Karen?
I was trying to reflect on why I see so little humor in this book at this point. I do see the comic, I see the grotesque, I see that. But to me, even in these first 12 chapters, there's a very melancholic condition for me. And that's sort of where I traveled with it. And the melancholy has to do with sort of just existence at this time and how these characters are existing. So
I sort of got caught up in that and not so much in the melancholy. I mean, in the humor. It's a book of mourning almost, even now. I mean, I have read it, I know how it ends, I know how it progresses, but this whole melancholic air, I don't think we should lose sight of. And, you know, we've already had domestic violence, we have sexual violence, we've had really poverty, gambling. There are all these overlays of just the melancholic condition of our modern existence, I guess. Don't mean to be a downer, but that's sort of where I traveled with these first 12 chapters already.
Clark?
I just wanted to affirm John's comment about Quilp and Kid. I teach ninth graders, and every day I see ninth grade boys who can only communicate by hitting each other, breaking into a raucous wrestling match there in the classroom, and that's their means of communication. And no matter what I say, that's what works for them. The other thing is, I've never read this novel before, and I would say before this point that maybe my favorite villain was Iago. I think Quilp has supplanted Iago for me as my favorite villain because he is so inventive. And as you said, John, I want to know what he's going to do next. I know it's going to be horrible, but I'm drawn to the car wreck that he is for other people. So I think Dickens has created a fascinating bad guy.
John, you're muted.
Mute. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Karen's comment about the melancholy of the book. That's an important element we should not lose sight of. And for me, the principal source of the melancholy is Nell's isolation. Nell is alone in the world. Nell has no playmates. If Quilp is a kind of diabolical playmate with the boy, Nell has no friends in the world. She's alone, isolated, and that makes her vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And I think that loneliness of Nell, her closest companion is the grandfather. And yet the grandfather is using her, loving her, but using her as his motive for gambling. So Nell is a victim of the love of her grandfather rather than the beneficiary of it. At least that's one way to think of her. And her isolation in the world is profound. So will there be other people whom she will encounter as her life goes forward, who will offer her kindness, who will offer her love? That's, I think, a real question. Glenna.
I think that's one of the reasons that the narrative seems so odd, because the first 3 chapters you think, well, here's this poor little girl, but she has a friend. And then, you know, the Master Humphrey character just vanishes. And then she's really alone.
There's Kit, right?
Yeah, but
No.
he's a little kid. And you have the first 3 chapters, it seems like you have somebody with real agency in the world who's going to be able to help.
Master Humphrey, but he's gone. Why does he abandon her? We could put it that way. Why does Master Humphrey leave when Nell needs a friend? Good point. Good point. Kit is the closest thing she has to a friend. but he seems limited.
Well, I don't want to be a spoiler, but in the second half of the novel, the single gentleman shows up. Unfortunately, he's too late to accomplish what he wants to do.
We shouldn't go ahead. We shouldn't go beyond.
Yeah, I
won't.
I won't be a spoiler.
Well,
Edgar Allan Poe seems to have thought that that character, when he shows up, is Master Humphrey returning. I don't know how Poe got that idea, but maybe Poe had had too much opium that night when he wrote that review. I'm not sure.
Have we talked about Dick Swiveller? Whoops.
A little bit.
Kathy Gill.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Because I just spoke with my daughter today about my 14-year-old girl granddaughter, I was, of course, thinking about Nell. And a question that occurred to me is, how much time did Dickens spend with his own children to understand? For example, my daughter was emphasizing how much sleep a 14-year-old girl needs, how it's so crucial to get enough sleep. And thinking of Nell staying up, that's one thing. Another thing is, how much did the grandfather warn her about being out in the streets of London at night, given the kind of people who may have been out, drinking their gin or whatever, to trust a stranger and even hold his hand? Just seemed kind of remarkable. And then the other thing that is certainly clear about a young teenage girl is how important girlfriends are, and how important at school to have their little group. They eat their lunch together, they walk to and from school, etc. So it just seemed like her situation is so sad for a 14-year-old girl and so unprotected. And hearing about marriage, I didn't know that girls could get married at age 13, but I think I have read that puberty back in that time often wasn't until girls were maybe 17 or 18. It was much later in the development of a female than it is now. So getting married so young just seems kind of amazing if people wanted offspring right away. Anyway, those are just thoughts thinking about a girl of that age in London at that time, how she was treated, how she must have felt, is very, very poignant and sad.
Very good observations, all of them. Grandfather seems to offer no practical advice about the dangers of walking through the streets of London at night. Yeah. Grandfather is not a protector. Grandfather is fixated on his obsession or his addiction.
Addiction, yeah.
And uses her as his emissary, as his go-between, without thought for her welfare, really. Yeah. I mean, he thinks he's concerned with her welfare, but that's only in order to acquire the money that will provide the abstract wealth that will protect her. But he offers little protection. Yeah. And we'll see how that develops as the book goes forward. Master Humphrey seems like he would be a friendly presence in her life, but he's gone. He's gone from the book. Will anyone else replace her? Particularly a same-sex, a girlfriend. Her vulnerability sexually, particularly in the presence of Quilp. I mean, Quilp is polymorphous, desire, sexuality, disinhibition, appetite of all kinds. He's a dangerous person to be around, and Nell at least knows enough to be frightened of him. But No, these are all very, very important concerns. And it comes back to the melancholy that Karen raised, which I think is closely related to her loneliness, her isolation, her emotional isolation. There's no one. Kit is the closest that she has in her life to someone who makes her laugh. Her voice used to be a happy voice, but it's a lonely voice at this point in the book. And she's the object of a marriage plot. You know, one of the things that we might wonder about is what's going to happen with Fred Trent and Swiveller and the plan to marry Nell to Swiveller for the grandfather's money. Well, we learn that the grandfather doesn't have any money, but what about this plot that is underway? That's a kind of you know, horrible. You know, find a wife, but only for the money that she will bring with her as the grandfather dies and Nell will inherit everything. We see that doesn't have real possibilities, real world possibilities. But is that a plot that the book will continue, or is that a plot that's going to disappear? So, Pat.
Yeah, I've never read this novel before, and she's surrounded by wolves. It seems like it's really ominous and foreboding. And since we don't know kind of how it goes from here, those of us who never read it before, it's left us in a weird spot because they've packed up and they're on the road. But what will happen?
And as far as Dickens's relationship with his children, he liked to play with them, but if he had an understanding of their inner lives, it's not evident in the information that we have.
Margaret?
Okay, I'd just like to make a quick point that there is one paragraph that is the idea between Fred Trent and Swiveller that perhaps the grandfather is a miser. And I love that paragraph and the fact that we're going to read Silas Marner along with this. And at the Dickens universe, when I've wonderfully participated in it, you know, for 5 years and loved it. But if we had two books, we were talking about them at the same time. And so I had thought that I needed to read Silas Marner before, you know, joining in this, but no, we're going to do it separately.
Yes.
And there was another point I wanted to make, but now after jabbering along like this, I've forgotten what it is. So, oh, I wanted to ask Pat, the woman who spoke just recently, who hadn't read the book before. Pat, where do you think the grandfather was going at night? Did you have any idea of where he was going and when little Nell was waiting for him all night? Did you imagine where he might have gone?
Well, it did kind of allude to that fact that he was out gambling somewhere. I mean, I don't know that I assumed that or that was included within the novel. Was it or was it not? You remember me?
I think it wasn't until it was revealed. I had no idea. I read it also for the first time.
Okay. Remember, I thought that Kit was also a dwarf. So I'm totally off base.
Well, Sarah, where did you think he was going?
I didn't see until they revealed it. I wasn't sure where he was going, but I thought he has a night job, a serious
Yeah.
night job, because he seemed like a very caring grandfather. And part of it, as I said before, it was just because she loved him so much and she protected him so much, the girl, Nellie. And we had no idea until a certain point that she's really miserable, that she's really scared at night.
Thank you.
I see we've gone beyond our scheduled stopping time, so I need to bring our discussion for today to an end. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Wayne. And we will see David Brownell to lead us next month. And thank all of you for your contributions and for listening to the discussion. So
thank you.
Have a good Halloween, and think about Quilp as the trick-or-treaters go around. And
a good election day.
And a good election day.
Yeah.
See you next month.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.